Time's River by Jim Lee. Chapter 5, The Goats, Johnny, Jeffrey, and Sprout. Weakened, weary, and sick of heart, I felt my mind might come apart. So grieved was I, as I wandered onward. If the whole world lies out of joint, and valor truly has no point, are then all our best intentions squandered? My strength, so great when I'd set forth, had dwindled since I left the north, and so I feared my feet might now fail me. Ahead, 3 goats now blocked my path. Not fearing any unchained wrath, they sought to harm, or at least derail me. But deep reserves, it seems I had. Inside I snapped, and nearly mad, I attacked them all, like a beast half crazed. Enraged, I leaped, expression dire, and hurled the first into a fire, and it cursed me as in the flames it blazed. The second sought to gore my eyes, and so imagine his surprise. Orange tongues consumed him too. Oh, how sad. The smallest, then, clung to my legs, but drained I his blood to the dregs, with shining fangs I didn't know I had. Of course, burning with rage, I had meant every word, but as the bright fire of that anger settled to a slow burn, the difficulty in making good on my threat became clear. While I had managed to jimmy open a portion of this thing, whatever it was, that was happening to me, it was far from something over which I had any real control. Whatever the source for the flash of inspiration which had saved me from Edwin's machete, it seemed to be gone now. When I went home, I expected a fair amount of panic over my disappearance overnight, and was not disappointed. I told Mom I had gone down to the river to look for something I had lost the previous day, a pocket knife. In the failing light, I must have fallen and hit my head or something. I wasn't really sure, I said. I had decided that a certain amount of confusion in such a circumstance would be believable, and didn't try to overpopulate my story with fabricated detail, which might make it suspicious as the fabric of lies that it was. I said that I must have bitten my tongue when I fell, because it hurt quite a bit. This, at least, was true. It was inflamed and dark red on that side. My mother narrowed her eyes at me when I told her this. She grabbed my chin and tilted my head back so she could look directly into my eyes. "Was there anything else?" she asked. I wanted to tell her everything. I felt so tired, so alone. But I could not imagine a world where anyone would believe anything I said, even her. I couldn't find my knife. Dad gave me that. It had his company logo on it and everything, I confessed mournfully, and allowed my face to sag with the disappointment I should have felt for such a thing. Her aspect softened, but hesitantly. Then she smiled and said, "Don't worry about it. Your father has lost many things in his time, as have I. We don't like to lose things, because Satan is the architect of loss and waste, and we deny him victories whenever we can. It may be that it will turn up yet. Failing that, perhaps someone needed it even more than you. God can use any situation for good, Winston." I tried to paint a wistful smile on my face. I could not imagine any good that God could make from what had happened, now or ever. And how could God stand by and do nothing while that... "Winston? Are you all right?" she was asking with growing alarm. "Your hands," she said as she pointed. As I thought again of Frank's base axe, I had clenched my fists so tightly my fingernails were biting into my palm and the knuckles were white. I loosened them and saw fading grooved crescents in my palms flare with color as the blood returned. "It's fine," I said with a sigh. "I know I shouldn't be, but I'm just mad about it. I like that knife." "Things can be replaced, Winnie," she laughed. "As long as you're all right, something like a knife, even one given to you that has meaning, is inconsequential. It is your love for your father and his love for you that made the gift special. But even when the gift is lost or taken away, the love remains. Love always remains, Winnie." I wanted to scream at her then, to demand that she explain how she could say such a thing, when I could personally attest that not only did love not always remain, Sometimes it was possible for it to be erased from existence completely, to be made as though it had never been, and leave you only with an aching hole where someone else should be. I thought, as all children do when they're growing up, that no one could possibly understand what I was feeling. Instead, I said nothing. What could I say? What was there I could possibly say to unburden my heart that would not see me bundled off to the booby hatch post-haste? I sighed again, and she patted my back, and I went to my room and lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. Later that day, I went off into the field at the end of the street, facing the woods. In my hand, I held the knife I had lost. It was true, I did like it, but I couldn't have it found and make lies of my tale. So, checking first that I had not been observed, I drew back and scaled it as high and far as I could in an arc above the trees and out of this tale. In the last days of summer, I spent a lot of time sleeping, trying to recapture my dream of time as a thing that could be controlled and manipulated, trying to find a way to get justice for Mandy. As it happened, though, I needn't have bothered. The chain of causality had already been set into motion. After I had called him, Frank's behavior had become decidedly more erratic. Later that day, he had grabbed a kid off the sidewalk, hoisted him in the air by the bunched fabric of his shirt, and demanded of him what he was doing creeping around the place. The boy had only been scooting along the sidewalk, sitting on a skateboard and pushing himself along backward with his feet. He had wailed, terrified, until Frank had thrown him down to the grass with the admonition, in his usual salty vernacular, to go away and never come back. The boy had fled, crying, down the street, all the way home. The boy had told his parents, who had called the police. When the police arrived, one middle-aged, one hardly more than a kid himself, they rang the bell, then knocked, then banged on the door, but no response came from inside. The old lady who had spoken to me, Mrs. Eleanor Washburn, had been only too happy to interject and tell them that he wasn't home, that she had seen the whole thing, and that Frank had since taken off in his rust bucket of a car. She then regaled them with tales of Frank's other recent odd behavior. "When my husband Donald was alive, he would have seen to it that a uniform was sent out to keep an eye on the place until he returned. Donald was a detective for your department, God rest his soul. He always told me that I had an instinct for sniffing out bad eggs, and that man is one, or I've never seen one," she told them. "Thank you, Mrs. Washburn," the taller officer said. He looked at her with the hint of a smile. "As it happens, I was just thinking that very thing. We can't have kids walking the streets in our town being assaulted," he tisked. "I knew your husband, ma'am. I was fresh out of the academy then, but I remember him well. He was a good cop." The two men walked back to their patrol car. "Rest easy, ma'am. We'll take care of this," said the taller cop. Foy, his badge read. Eleanor thought he had an honest face and nodded her head, satisfied. And they had. Officer Foy couldn't convince the captain that there was anything worth wasting a stakeout team on over some kid getting shaken up, so he had decided to just keep an eye out after he went off duty. And he could eat a sub from Vinny's for dinner in his car, just as easily as he could do it in the stifling heat of his third-floor apartment, couldn't he? Sure he could. And it seems his partner, Lewis, thought it a corker of an idea as well. And if they just happened to be eating their dinner up the hill from the O'Leary place, what of it? A citizen has rights, he thought. And he thought the old lady was right. He remembered the story the wife had given him last fall about tripping and bashing her face on the floor when he had gotten the domestic call at the place. He didn't buy it then, but with her denial, there hadn't really been anything they could do. He had gone back a few days later to check and see if she was okay, and this O'Leary guy had told him she had left him, run off to live with her sister. Good, he had thought to himself. Piece of crap like you doesn't deserve a loyal woman like that. It had been so easily believable that she would have finally had enough and split. But now, maybe there was more to the story. Maybe the guy had done something to her, and the pressure of living with it was starting to make him crack. We shall see, he thought. He was beginning to think this particular egg might be really rotten. The brown paper the sandwiches came wrapped in, had been lying crumpled into balls on the floor for nearly 2 hours before Frank had shown up. The old Plymouth chugged into the driveway and coughed and sputtered, dieseling for a minute before dying completely. The two men stepped out of their car and, without a word between them, in the manner that partners form over time as they work in unison, they approached O'Leary on foot. O'Leary had gotten out and had opened the trunk of the Valiant and was rummaging among what appeared to be black hefty bags. He was filthy. His pants were smeared with dirt and mud, and his boots were caked with more of the same. He finally found what he appeared to be looking for as he pulled out a long garden shovel. He turned around and then jerked with surprise at the sight of the two men, whom he had not heard approaching. "Beautiful evening, isn't it, Mr. O'Leary?" Foy asked, as he flashed his badge. "Newfield Police. We tried to stop by earlier, but you weren't home. We wanted to ask you a few questions," he explained reasonably. He gestured to the hefty bags. "Been keeping busy?" Frank's eyes darted back and forth between the two officers, who had separated to put about 8 feet between them. "You don't look like cops," he grunted. "Oh, well, we don't sleep in our uniforms," said Lewis, flashing his own. "But we're Newfield Blue through and through," he quipped, as he lightly thumped his chest with his left hand while keeping his right at the ready by his side. "So, what you got in the bags?" "Nothing," he blurted. Then, looking at the shovel in his hand and the mud all over himself, he added, "I've been digging for night crawlers. I'm on vacation, gonna do some fishing." "Really? Those must be some monsters," Lewis exclaimed in mock astonishment, "to have a load of them up in hefty bags. Why, I'm a bit of an amateur angler myself. What say you let me have a peek?" Lewis leaned forward toward the vehicle. "Not without a warrant," Frank growled, and stepped in front of Lewis to prevent him from reaching into the trunk. "A warrant? For night crawlers?" Lewis laughed. "Don't worry, I'm not trying to find out your secret digging spot. I'd just like to take a gander at such incredible bait. What do you say, sport?" He leaned to the side, trying to see into the trunk. O'Leary brought the shovel up into a menacing stance and shoved forward with both hands, striking Lewis in the chest with the handle of the shovel. Lewis lost his balance and tumbled backward. O'Leary raised the shovel above his head, clearly preparing to brain the man with it, when he felt a cold circle of steel press into his back through the thin, grungy tank top he was wearing. "Put it down, now," Foy demanded. Frank opened his hands and put them up. The shovel, which he had been holding aloft, then came swinging down in a lazy arc that glanced off the right side of the top of Foy's head with a clong. Foy staggered back, dazed, and the .38 pistol he had been holding clattered to the pavement, dropping from his limp fingers. Frank hesitated for only a moment. Then he dived for the pistol and scooped it up. As he turned back, bringing the weapon up, a single shot rang out. Lewis was still on the ground, propped up on his left arm, with his .38 in his right hand. A tiny wisp of smoke rose from the barrel, the remains of the gun oil with which the firearm had been meticulously maintained, though it had never been fired except at the range. A clean black hole had been punched through the front of Frank's wife-beater tank top. Around this pupil, a dark, sanguine iris began to swell, an eye opening upon the moment of death, a witness of yet another crossing from one wasted existence to whatever awaits us all in the dark. Frank dropped the pistol, then dropped to his knees, then fell forward on his face. The same color which filled that eye was draining rapidly away from Lewis's face. "Aye," he stammered. Foy groaned, clutching his head, and squinted at Lewis through the fog which seemed to fill it. "You did what you had to do. You very likely just saved both our lives," he said, as he leaned heavily on the Plymouth's bumper. He reached in and fumbled clumsily with one of the zigzagging plastic strips used to seal the throat of each bag closed. His sister's kid called these strips lightning bolts, as they kind of look like a cartoony bolt of lightning. The kid liked to throw them around the house, pretending he was some sort of thunder god. Kids. As Foy released this one, the rancid odor of putrefaction smote him in the face. He felt his gorge rising and barely had time to turn his face away before bringing Vinny's meatball special back up the express elevator and spraying the pavement and the tire with it. Poking out of the open bag was a badly decayed human hand, with a gold ring set with a tiny pebble of diamond around one withered finger. Most of this made its way into Foy's report. He prided himself on being thorough. There were, though, still some details he forgot. Details I could have gladly provided from my vantage point as I watched the whole grisly matter play itself out over and over in the scrolling imagery playing before my dreaming eyes. I would watch the whole thing, continuing on as the officers stumbled back to Foy's car and called it in, while the neighbors filed out of the nearby buildings to watch the show. I have said that there's nothing children enjoy more than a show. I must now stand corrected, for it is clear that adulthood does not banish that desire from us. In the days that followed, the hunting dogs in the press dutifully reported what I already knew. This was Christina O'Leary. She had never gotten away after all. Perhaps upon sobering up enough to realize that the damage he had done to his bride was incriminating evidence he could not simply command away, or whether he was still inebriated, I do not know. I did not want to look to find out. Perhaps he had caught her trying to leave. Surely that made a plausible source for his story to Mandy about her going to Maine. He hadn't struck me as the creative type. He had killed her, and then, either in an effort to be clever or out of simple brutish rage, he had dismembered her body and buried it somewhere. In several somewheres, for all I know. As I say, I did not want to look. It seemed clear that when I called him and told him, "You killed her," he had assumed it was this crime that I was speaking about. The idea that his daughter's death should also lie at his feet appeared not to have occurred to him, and that made me angrier each time I watched the tableau unfold. He had apparently become convinced that the caller had located the remains and clearly meant to find some way to remove them beyond reach, though what exactly he imagined he could do to hide them from me was unclear. Foy and Lewis were given commendations for heroism, for actions above and beyond the call of duty. From the time that the machine in my head started working again, I began to watch their heroic actions every night, over and over and over. I couldn't touch anything, but I could see everything. While the nightly showings of this gruesome feature were going on, high school had begun. During the day, I floated through the actions that were expected of me, with very little of my focus on what was happening in the world around me. Fortunately, it seemed that the curriculum was geared to expect this kind of disorientation from the new freshman, and the demands placed on my intellect were almost ridiculously light. And at night, I feasted on vengeance. There were a few wrinkles, though. Brian, for example. You may recall that it was Brian who had introduced me to Matthew McElroy. It seemed that Matt had lost his taste for harassing other children. This might have had something to do with me, for I confess, when I saw him rolling down the hall past me on the second day at the new school, I reached out and laid my hand on his shoulder. He looked at me, his eyes still carrying much of the contempt that they always had, even though they had seen much since I had last beheld them. "What do you want?" he sneered. "I just wanted to say," I said, and then, as one of those pulses of darkness flashed before my eyes, the same as the ones I had seen during my phone call to Frank, I leaned forward, making pointed eye contact, and added, "I'm so sorry, Matthew." The effect was immediate and quite satisfying. He recoiled from me as though I had hurled a bucket of snakes at him. He tripped over his own feet in his effort to back away and fell flat on his back. His arms held up before his face as if to ward me off. The books he had been carrying went flying, and in the silence that had fallen, I could hear the book covers, made of brown paper bags, making a soft shh as the books slid across the plastic tiling of the floor. He screamed at me, "Get away from me, you freak!" I leaned over him and offered my hand as if to help him up. "That's not very nice, Matthew. I just wanted to tell you that," I hissed in a voice barely above a whisper, as almost total darkness filled my eyes. "I'm so sorry." He scrambled backwards away from me as I continued to walk forward, following with my hand extended. "Whatever! Fine! I'm sorry for calling you a freak. Just leave me alone!" The other children backed away from the two of us, just as they had done that first day in junior high school. Sorry, middle school. But now their faces were filled with perplexity and confusion rather than eagerness, baffled as the hulking bully retreated across the floor before this seemingly timid rabbit. "As you wish," I said calmly, and withdrew my hand. I turned, and the crowd parted before me as I walked away, and behind me I heard a new whispering begin for the first time. It was a soft, ululating sound, like a babbling brook heard through the trees on a warm spring day, and it was filled with fear. At the time, I thought it was glorious. I felt no remorse at his terror. The way I saw it, his return to life had been bought and paid for by Mandy's death, and I rued the exchange. I learned much from the whispering. I learned a few days later that Matthew had confided in his closest friends that he would have sworn that the voice that came out of me in the hallway was his father's. Of course, in selecting friends, he had opted for quantity over quality. Unlike Paul and Kevin, Matt's friends had spread his secret like wildfire, and my legend grew. In spite of all of this, Brian was still Brian. Having given up on Matthew, he had found another boy to play sycophant to. Johnny Lucas was a junior, and it couldn't have been more than a week that school had been in session before Brian made his latest introduction. Johnny was not quite the same height and build as Matthew, a little shorter, a little thinner. Any deficit he possessed in mass, though, he made up for in malice. While Matthew was at least friendly in his way to his little crowd of followers, Johnny seemed to hate everyone equally. I had never met him before, but I had gone to elementary school with his younger brother Jeffrey, who had been the boy responsible for crafting the clever verbal dart, "Satan lives," that had made me cry. No, I don't know why it made me cry. My, oh my. Sigh. I still wasn't using my machine to read forward. As I've said, trying to do so was painful, somehow. But when I heard Brian's shrill, snot-filled voice cry out, "That's him!" in the cafeteria, I didn't require that source of prescience to know what was on today's menu. So this is the little pansy that used to cry when Jeffrey would say, "What was it again? Oh yeah, I remember. Satan lives!" He breathed this last out in an almost hilarious pantomime of bad horror movie acting. Roar! He had obviously gone over this line several times in his head, and I didn't wish to disappoint such a commitment to a bit. I have no reason to doubt that he does. In fact, I have it on good authority that he's been spending nights with your mom. Perhaps you'd care to meet him face to face, and we can all chat. I'm sure something could be arranged, I said nonchalantly. Clearly not expecting this response, Johnny seemed to have no plan B. A couple snickers from kids at nearby tables suggested that I had scored a point. "Maybe I should just punch your face in, smartass," he came back. "If that's your best material, maybe you should and have done with it," I replied calmly. He did. Well, tried to. I made no effort to stop him, and perhaps that unnerved him. I find it hard to believe that the punch I felt was the most force he could muster, though it did bloody my nose and mash my upper lip into my teeth, and I did taste blood. Delicious, salty blood. The room darkened before my eyes. I began laughing. A tall male teacher had spotted the incident and had rushed over to pull him away from me before things could continue. As he was being hauled away, Johnny yelled at me, "What are you laughing at? I'm not done with you." I reached up and touched the trickle of blood coming from my nose and looked at it and continued laughing. "I haven't decided yet, but when I know, you'll know. And yes, you are," I chuckled, though I had to call out that last as he disappeared through the door of the cafeteria. And I kept right on laughing until the bell rang for us to go back to class. That night's entertainment took a detour. Normally, I would settle in to watch Foy and Lewis arrive at Spring Street to bang on the door for a while and let the show begin. But tonight, I had business to attend to. Before going to bed, I looked up Johnny and Jeffrey's number in the white pages of the phone book. It was there, and listed with it was the address. I flipped to the section between the white pages and the yellow pages, where there were several blue pages containing listings for federal, state, and local governmental numbers, police, that sort of thing. Along with these were a few glossy color pages included, which featured local maps and a few advertisements. I found the address on the map and went to bed. Once I was fully asleep, I found my way back to the machine. The path to it was becoming well-worn in my mind, and it had become easier and easier to conjure it up. I seized the controls and didn't bother with rewind or fast-forward. I only wanted zoom. I zoomed out far enough so that I could see the town from above. Once I was high enough to see the town's major landmarks, the river, the four-leaf clover interchange of the two highways that crossed, I found I had to rotate my view to make sense of it. Having done that, I was able to follow the lines of the streets, slowly moving in until I found the street I sought, then the individual house. It stood before me, a hideous hodgepodge of construction materials. Based on the amount of debris and construction tools and equipment lying about the yard in various states of disrepair, I gathered that their father was in the building trade. He appeared to have applied his questionable skill set to his own home. Additions and extensions sprouted from what had undoubtedly originally been a nice, if modest, home. Now it was a horrible conglomeration of various styles, materials, colors, and shapes. It would have made a perfect home for Peter Keating. I nudged the controls of my machine to allow me to zoom through the wall and smacked my face into a ghastly stucco section which sat incongruously aside a gleaming brushed aluminum grid that seemed to make up a bay window. I tried again, more cautiously this time, and felt my nose flatten against the hard, irregular surface of the stucco. I reached out my hand and felt it, gritty and unyielding. I could not pass through it. I was flummoxed. Of all the times I had traveled in the machine, I could not ever recall encountering solid resistance. Of course, I had had other dreams where things seemed solid enough. Both times I had been able to enter Matthew's house and hold the shotgun. And before that, the bullwhip, which later turned out to be my combination lock, that was solid. But Frank and his house and the people in the nightly matinee which surrounded it were all insubstantial to me. I could not touch them. Touch. An arrow of illumination struck and stood quivering in my brain. I had been able to touch places where the people there had touched me first. Specifically, Matthew had assaulted me, Johnny had assaulted me. Matthew's father had not attacked me the first time, but I had grabbed his wrist and made contact before I bit my tongue in return there. There was definitely something here which I needed to puzzle over, that and the blood. Something about contact and blood acting as the trigger. But that would have to wait for another time. I was here now, and I couldn't go inside. It was no different than if I had snuck out of the house and ridden my bike here, for all that I could do here like this. Or was that true? I could zoom in until I was tiny by comparison. I moved over to the front door and tried this. Yes, I could zoom in until the hideous house was massive, where the uneven crack below the improperly hung front door became an equally massive void. I looked through the cavernous gap and saw a Doberman Pinscher sleeping in the foyer beyond. This raised an important question. If things here were tangible to me, could they harm me? I walked over to one side of the door frame, where a sharp corner of the aluminum footplate stuck out. I scraped my hand across the point and felt an acute burning in my hand and looked down to see a ragged scrape. I looked again at the dog. It seemed to be sleeping, but I had known dogs who would sham sleep while waiting for a squirrel or cat to get close enough, and then they would spring. If this dog did that, somebody might be picking the brightly colored remains of my chewed clothing out of some Doberman poop. I zoomed back out to my normal size. Hang on, what if... I zoomed out some more until I was double my regular size and pressed my hand against the door. It was still solid. I stifled my laughter and zoomed out until I towered over the house. I crouched down and touched the door with one huge extended finger. The door was solid. I applied a little pressure, and the door creaked and groaned under the strain. Force against tangible objects was proportional to size. I straightened up and looked down at the chimney, merrily spewing a stream of smoke. It would seem that the handyman fancied himself a mason as well, and had built himself a full-size fireplace for this abomination of a house. What happened next, the ease with which I did it, haunts me to this day. My intent, was to crush the chimney, to squeeze its throat closed, forcing belching smoke to pour through the house. In my mind's eye, a dream within a dream, if you will, I saw the family running out onto the lawn, dressed only in their pajamas or underwear, coughing and spluttering through the choking smoke as I floated away, invulnerable to any retribution. But I had overestimated the competence of the builder. I balled up my fist and thumped on the roof of the place 3 times as if pounding on a door. The building settled noticeably with this hammering, but I thought nothing of it. I yelled out, meaning to say, "Oh, Johnny!" But like the proportionality of the force I exerted, my voice was resonating at a much lower frequency. I sounded like some cyclopean behemoth. Inspired by this, I said, "Oh, Johnny! This is Satan, Johnny! I'm here to see your mom!" I faintly heard some squeaking, terrified voices inside. "Not going to come out, eh? Well, Johnny, you know what they say. If you play with fire, you might get burned." As I spoke this last, the world of light attenuated to nothing but shadow. The moon overhead was a faint disk of blackness, slightly more visible than the deeper blackness around it, and nothing more. Yet I could still see. And with that, I clutched the chimney in one massive fist and crushed its windpipe. From within, I heard the sounds of the bricks grinding together, popping into pulverized powder under the pressure. And then, further down, I heard something else. I can only describe it as a crunch, followed by numerous ceramic-sounding clattering noises. It sounded like the entire chimney and fireplace were collapsing into a heap of rubble. I released the portion which I had been holding, and it collapsed into the hole in the roof through which it had poked. The little stream of smoke choked out for a minute or two, replaced by a cloud of pulverized brick and mortar dust. Then it began to recover, then to outpace itself. The fire within had not been quenched. Rather, in the collapse of the fireplace, the hot coals had been scattered across the floor, first smoldering, then igniting. A bright blaze of now unrestrained fire began to chew at the floor, the furniture, the walls. And then the flames were licking the edges of the hole in the roof. The glare of the fire burned me. I hissed with pain through clenched teeth as I felt my skin sizzling, and I drew back, zooming out and upwards. I could hear the voices of the people inside shrieking now. They had made it out of their rooms and discovered the destruction. Well, it hadn't gone quite as I expected, I thought, but at least I'd have made an impression. I wouldn't be bothered by this bunch again. Then I heard pounding on the front door. The people were hammering it, trying to get it open. I recalled the way the house had settled when I knocked, and the shoddy way the whole construction job had looked when I was tiny, and realized I had crushed it so that now the door would not open. And that's when I heard the third child's voice, a high-pitched baby's cry, ringing out over the roar of the hungry fire. Realizing at last that my actions were endangering innocence as well as the guilty, I zoomed in to try to knock the door down, but the blazing fire was torment. Not the heat of it, you understand, the light. I could not approach, no matter how hard I tried. I could no more help the child than I could drive an ice pick into my own eye, for that is what it felt like if I even tried to look toward the burning core of the conflagration. And then all the voices ceased, save one. The voice of the hungry maw of the flames continued to roar. I fled into the darkness. I tried to wake, but found I didn't exactly know how to do that. I thought that perhaps I should return home, to familiar surroundings, to signal to my dreaming brain that the dream had ended, but this would cause me to wake up. So I zoomed out to the height I had done before and homed in on the place that I called home. I restored myself to normal size and floated down and zoomed through my closed bedroom window and smacked my face on it as well and tumbled to the ground. I still slept in simple cotton pajama bottoms in those days. These were all I had on. I had no house key and the door was locked. My window was unlocked, as I opened it often when I was warm, but I could not reach it from the ground. No problem, I thought, and reached for the mental controls to the zoom function, and found there was nothing there. The machine was gone. I was simply standing in my pajama bottoms, dreaming of the outside of my house. Wasn't I? I thought back to the incident in the 6th grade, with the combination lock where I'd seemed to be missing a piece of time when I sleepwalked across the playground. Was it possible that I had done that tonight? Did I just dream all of these things while I walked all around? Did I actually go to the Lucas's house? If you have never had occasion to question the trustworthiness of the reality your senses present to you, it may be difficult for you to grasp the breadth of the panic which now overcame me. Imagine you are laying in a lounge chair on a beach. The sun is warm, the breezes are cool and refreshing, and every now and then a soft murmur of the surf will be broken by the call of a seagull in the distance. Above you, a person you might describe as beautiful and attractive is fanning you gently. Every so often, the fan will brush you, ever so lightly. Now imagine a video screen is wheeled up in front of you. On it is displayed a medieval torture chamber with a slab-like surface featured in the center of the room. Around the periphery of this room, the walls are festooned with all manner of horrible-looking implements of torture. In rooms adjacent to the one on the display, you can hear the sounds of unbearable torment. These cries, you notice, are eerily in concert to the cries of your gulls. And on this slab, you, though unfettered. And as you watch, every time the image of you is pierced with a blade wielded by the troll-like torturer in that room, you feel the fan brush your skin, and in the same place. The version of you in the display is smiling at first, but as your expression changes to one first of curiosity, then concern, then terror, your doppelganger mimics your expression. You wave your hands in rapid and unpredictable movement, but your double replicates every move, every twitch, every sound, with no lag, no delay, no desynchronization, no error. And all the while, as the fan brushes you, your double continues to bleed from each new wound. Before long, you will desire to leave this place, no matter how comfortable it feels, nor how attractive the attendant, because you will become uncertain which place you are actually in. Now imagine that when you attempt to depart, the attendant physically restrains you. At the same time, your double's persecutor applies restraints to them. Far more barbaric and terror-inspiring than the simple leather straps your attendant has employed, but which make contact with your skin in all the same places. And your attendant and your double's tormentor reply at the same time, "It's for your own good." Yours in a pleasant and gentle admonishing tone, your double's in a harsh, grating screech, but at the same time, the same pace. If you perform this thought experiment, you may begin to understand how I felt, shivering outside my room in the absolute blackness, uncertain of whether I was awake or asleep. When I tried to rub my arms, to use friction to generate a little heat to warm me, yelps of pain came from my skin. From the line of my pajama bottoms up on my right side, which had been facing the chimney when the flames began to pour out of the hole in my dream, my skin felt like it was horribly sunburned. I stood there for a while, and then I remembered the stepladder in the shed. The shed had a combination lock, so I could open that. I went and opened the shed, got the ladder and set it by my window, and climbed up and slid the window noiselessly open. I climbed in and dropped into my bed, and mercifully I was not sharing the room with anyone anymore. I went back outside, carefully leaving the door unlocked behind me, and went back outside to put the ladder away. I finished that and finally slipped quietly into bed. The alarm clock next to my bed showed that it was 3:12 a.m., in the faintest digits I had ever seen. I turned to face the ceiling and tried to sleep. I slept not a wink, only watched the light continue to grow in the room until it became an unbearable, blinding glare reflecting at me from every surface. Even with my eyes closed, it seemed to only add a pink hue to the glare, though pulling all the covers over my head seemed to help. When my alarm went off, I reached out for my cocoon and turned it off. Not long after, my mother came in to wake me. She had become accustomed to having to do this, as I had developed a marked penchant for sleeping in. "Come on, young man, time for school," she said as she pulled the covers off me. "The early bird gets the—" "Winston, what on earth happened to your arm?" I turned to look at her, shading my eyes with my left hand. I don't know." "Dear Jesus, your eyes! What happened to your eyes?" There was no school for me that day. After putting on the darkest sunglasses we could find, I had suggested my father's welding goggles but was vetoed, and wrapping myself in thick clothes from head to toe, I was taken to the pediatrician, who pronounced the burns as nothing more than a severe sunburn. "Kids do goofy things," he assured my mother, outside the examination room, as though I were deaf, not practically blind. "He was probably fooling around with a sun lamp and fell asleep under the thing, and now he's too embarrassed to admit he did it. It's fine. He'll be sore for a few days, and then he'll peel like a baby snake, but he'll be fine." "What about his eyes?" She sounded on the verge of hysterics. I could recognize it because I felt like I was as well. "He had them closed. Why?" the quack responded. She stomped angrily in, leading him back to the side of the exam table. She tilted my head up and said, "Winston, open your eyes." I did so. The doctor gasped and said, "Jesus! Oh, sorry, ma'am, it gave me a start." My irises were fully dilated, almost invisibly thin around massive dark pupils. During the next 3 days, I did not sleep at all, nor did I awake, for I still had no idea which it was I was supposed to be trying to do. I stayed in my room with the shades and curtains drawn. I became increasingly delirious with each passing day. I was exhausted, but simply could not sleep. Various pharmaceuticals were prescribed and taken, but these only exacerbated my growing sense of demented confusion and were abandoned. At night, I thought I might pass the time during the quiet hours reading, as I tried not to disturb the rest of the house. Newspapers had piled up, and I began to read these by moonlight. It wasn't long before I found this on the front page of the paper, dated the afternoon of the first day I missed school. September 10th, 1982. Newfield Ledger. Family of 5 perishes in fire. Emergency services were called to Green Valley Drive in the early hours of Friday to combat a fire in a residential dwelling. Firefighters were unable to rescue any of the residents. The home belonged to Jason and Daphne Lucas, where they lived with their 3 boys, Jonathan, Jeffrey, and Jeremy, aged 17, 14, and 1. The youngest, nicknamed Sprout by his godparents who live in Massachusetts, was considered a miracle, born after Daphne's heroic struggle with cancer. Investigators have yet to release their official findings, but preliminary analysis suggests the home burned as a result of structural failures in the fireplace and chimney, which town records show were added by Jason himself. Numerous other code violations spotted on the scene may have played a role in the family's inability to escape the blaze. There will be no public funeral. Well-wishers are being asked to direct any charitable donations to the Shriners Hospital. After that, I lost interest in reading, and only read one other thing during my convalescence. This I had read over and over, considering its message with the possibility of new interpretations. A 5th word had joined the others, so it now read, "Lost eyes, find lies, free."